me, but I'm not used to the faculty in the imaging science have been since the dawn of time. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Chet Van Duzer. We've worked together. We've just been reminiscing about how long it's been. We've worked together since roughly 2011 and a variety of projects, including this one, which he tells me I process and I don't even remember. And so with Chet's help to find the objects, we've been doing with Greg Hayward and several other folks, been doing multispectral imaging of maps of interest. And Chet has several more that he wants us to work on. So retirement is received. So Chet, go.
Thank you very much, Roger. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'll be talking a bit about a Portuguese nautical chart of Africa that's thought to have been made around 1520. I have my doubts about that date that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail later. But I'll begin by, oops, how do we advance slides? It's stuck. All right. So I'll start with a few words about how I became interested in maps. So some of you will have heard a little bit about this earlier, but now we get to see with some pictures. So I was a visitor to the Vatican museums in the summer of 1997 as a tourist, and they happened to have a display of maps. And I saw this world map, which was made in about 1530. It appears in a manuscript of Ptolemy's geography that was made in the middle of the 15th century, so around 1450. And this manuscript was added to the manuscript later. At this point, I had a general interest in maps and the history of geography, and I knew a little bit about the subject. But this map really attracted my attention, and particularly the southern continent. So at the time, people believed that there had to be a southern continent as a theoretical construct. There had to be a southern landmass to counterbalance the northern ones. And one can find maps from this period with basically a large island at the South Pole. But in this case, as you can see, the southern continent is a ring of land around the South Pole. And if we zoom in on the western half of that land, there are letters along the bottom that start to spell out a phrase. And I'll first mention that we can see that there are place names everywhere in this continent. And then if we move over to the eastern half, we can see the end of the phrase. So it's Terra Incognita Australe, so the southern unknown land. So it's labeled as unknown, and yet it's full of place names. And zooming in, again, it's supposed to be unknown, but there are 6 little images of cities which are named in this southern continent. And in this peninsula that juts northward in the Indian Ocean, we again have the indication Terra Incognita right next to place names. So it's a very curious map and a very curious southern continent. And this really piqued my curiosity. So as I mentioned earlier, I was able to buy a poster of the map to study without having to deal with the Vatican bureaucracy for obtaining images. So this is what sparked my interest in the history of cartography. And I've since then spent a lot of time working on manuscripts of Ptolemy's geography. They always seem to have something of interest. And in fact, it was a different manuscript of Ptolemy's geography that sparked my interest in sea monsters on maps, about which I ended up writing a book. So this southern ring continent appears on other maps and globes. So this is an earlier globe made by Johann Schoner in 1515. We were talking earlier about terrestrial and celestial globes, and this is one of a pair. Johann Schoner made a celestial and terrestrial globe. It's a printed globe, So one would buy these sheets of paper and then wrap them around a sphere of the correct size. Here's the New World on his globe. And if we look at the bottom, we can see some of the southern continent. And if we rotate the globe, here we can see it. So in this case, it's not a complete ring, but it does have this remarkable hydrography. So these two large lakes surrounded by mountains connected by this enormous river. And as I was saying earlier, this was Schoner's way of representing the theory that the Nile floods in the summer when there are no rains in Egypt because it has its source in the southern hemisphere. So this is Schoner's representation of the source of the Nile in this mythical southern continent. So a particular map in the Beinecke Library got me interested in the imaging of cultural heritage objects. This spectacular world map by Enriquez Martellus, which, as I said, was a source that Martin Waldseemüller used in making his famous world map of 1507. So we managed to get a grant from the NEH to image the map. It's fun to see these pictures. They bring back a lot of good memories. So that's me on the left, Ken Boydston, the CEO of Megavision, Roger Easton, whom we all know, Michael Phelps, and Gregory Hayworth, who's right here. So here is the enormous easel I mentioned earlier that allowed us to move the map vertically and horizontally in front of the camera and lights. Another image of the setup and the equipment with the steel crossbars of the laser focusing mechanism, because the surface of the map was not even, so we had to refocus a lot. And we divided the map into a grid of 55 overlapping tiles for the purposes of imaging. And I'll just go through one example of the results we were able to obtain looking at the text block in the lower right. Here it is in infrared light. Sorry, let me go back. Sorry, infrared. It's very difficult to read. One can see letters, but trying to string them together into words would be very difficult. The ultraviolet was of no help at all. And here's the multispectral image. So with the right object, it's just like magic. And so this is a detail of Africa on the map. So this map was this great unstudied and unstudyable object in the Beinecke Library. It was on the wall for decades. And because the text had faded to illegibility, no one was really able to do anything with it. And through this project, we've made the map studyable in all its aspects. So you can see read the texts on it. You can see the river systems. You can see the little images of cities. And there's an image far to the south in Africa that has a cross above it. So it was very, very gratifying to turn this amazing map from this unstudyable object into something that can be studied in all its aspects. So working our way towards this map of Africa, I'll say a few words about nautical charts because this map is part of the nautical chart tradition. So here we have a typical nautical chart made by Battista Beccari, an Italian cartographer in 1403. And I know the contrast isn't great, so just to orient ourselves a little bit, here's the Iberian Peninsula, the boot of Italy, and we'll zoom in on the southern part of the boot. And when you can see one of the principal characteristics of nautical charts, which is that they have very dense place names written perpendicularly to the coasts, with the most important ones indicated in red. So nautical charts are tools for navigation. So if you're trying to navigate, it's the coastal features that are of greatest importance. And there was this graphic convention of indicating the more important locations in red. And then zooming back out, we can see that the chart is crisscrossed with these lines. These are called rhumb lines, R-H-U-M-B, and they radiate out from these specific points on the chart, which are the nodes of this rhumb line network. And the nodes of that network form a circle. And this is very typical of nautical charts. On some very large nautical charts, there will be 2 circles forming this network, but most charts like this one, there's 1. So with that background, we'll move on to this Portuguese map of Africa, which is at the University of Texas at Austin in the Harry Ransom Center. And it's Krauss 22 is part of a collection that was purchased at one time. And I'll mention that this is an ongoing project. So I've been working on the map for some time. I obtained some new images, new processed images of it recently from Keith Knox, and I've made some discoveries that should be helpful in moving forward on the project. So it's unsigned and undated, but the library's catalog suggests that it was made around 1520. We can see that the cartographer does not depict the eastern coast of Africa, and it's not the case that this area was unknown at the time. This reflects the cartographer's interests. This was not a map that was intended to help one navigate around Africa to reach the Indian Ocean. The focus was on the Atlantic world. We have a decorative compass rose at the left-hand edge of the map. I should say what is now the left-hand edge of the map. Here are the nodes of the rhumb line network. And what this indicates is that the map was cut at some point in its history. So it's helpful. The rhumb line networks are very interesting and very often useful. They can sometimes, in this case, it's very obvious that the map was cut, but in other cases, if you trace the circle of the rhumb line network, you can see that the circle goes off the edge of the map because it was trimmed at some point in a less obvious way. So there's another Portuguese map of Africa that has been dated to about 1524 in Minneapolis at the James Ford Bell Library. And these two maps are very closely related. They're different in interesting ways, but their depiction of the coasts of Africa and the place names on the coast of Africa are very, very similar. So just to demonstrate the similarity of their coastlines, if we zoom in a little bit and then fade from one map to the other and go back and forth, they are very similar indeed. So we might call them sister manuscript maps. At the same time, there are interesting differences between them. So the map at the James Ford Bell Library includes Brazil, so it extends further to the west. Moreover, the center point of the rhumb line network is considerably further to the west. Whereas on the Ransom Center map, the center point of the rhumb line network is much further to the east. It's really just off the coast of Africa. So studying the place names on the map are essential to determining its position in the history of cartography. But many of the place names on the Harry Ransom map are illegible, and it's easy to show that. So if we zoom in, we can see traces of place names here, but trying to read them is just about impossible with the naked eye in natural light. And if we zoom in at another point on the coast, the case is very similar. And it's worth pointing out that the place names written in black or brown ink present challenges to read. They're mostly legible, but it's the names originally written in red that have faded the most. And it's, as we saw earlier, it's the names in red that are actually the names of the more important places on the coast. Given the similarity between the two maps, the question arises as to whether we could study the place names on the Harry Ransom map by looking at those on the James Ford Bell map. But it turns out that that's not the case because the place names on the James Ford Bell map have also faded very dramatically. So two colleagues visited the Harry Ransom Center in January of 2019, Ken Boynston and Todd Hannikin, and they imaged the map as part of a demonstration of multispectral imaging. This was not, they didn't go there in order to image this map, but they wanted to demonstrate multispectral imaging, and this was proposed by the library staff as a possible candidate, and they imaged the map. It was imaged in 15 reflectance bands. I've indicated the nanometers there, and then 10 fluorescence bands as well. And my thanks to Roger Easton and Keith Knox for processing of the images. Again, Roger says he doesn't recall working on the map. It was some years ago that he worked on it. And for purposes of imaging, the map was divided into 10 tiles. So with rows and column numbers, that's how the images are labeled. And if we zoom in, the multispectral images are very helpful indeed. As I said, the names that are written in brown or black ink were more or less legible before, but nonetheless, the multispectral images are very helpful in making them more legible. The place names that were originally in red present much more of a challenge, even in the processed images. The images help, but as Keith was telling me, for whatever reason, the red pigment just didn't adhere as well to the parchment, didn't stay in the parchment as well. So try what one may in terms of processing, it's very difficult to satisfactorily reveal all of them. But in this case, for Cape Verde, the name comes out, which is in red because Cape Verde is an important spot on the coast of Africa. The multispectral images helped quite a bit in revealing that name. And in this case, we can now see the name a little bit better. Trying to read it is still a challenge. Looking at another spot on the coast, again, the multispectral image is extremely helpful. Looking at one of the names in red where there's hardly anything visible at all, we can at least start to see the shapes of characters there, thanks to the multispectral images. And in this case, it wasn't at all clear that it looked like there might be two halves of a word separated, but in the multispectral image, we can see that the name actually extends all the way across. And another case where with a naked eye or natural light, it's really hard to see anything. And with the multispectral image, we can at least start to see some of the letters. And then the possibility arises of comparing with other maps, not the one at the James Ford Bell Library, but other maps of the period to try and figure out what this place name should be. So as I said, now it's possible to read most of the place names on the map. We can compare with some of those on other maps. And I chose 4 maps that have been quite well studied. So the Cantino map, manuscript world map of circa 1502, the Caverio map, 1504, Waldseemüller's famous world map of 1507, the first to apply the name America to the New World. And Waldseemüller's later world map from 1516 is Carta Marina. We can zoom in on Africa. And if we have a look at the place names in northwestern Africa, I've here indicated the ones that do not appear on the earlier maps. And it's a higher percentage than one would have thought, particularly if this map really was made around 1520. So Waldseemüller's Carta Marina was made in 1516. If this map were really made 4 years later, it would be surprising that the place names had changed that dramatically. So this suggests that the map is somewhat later than 1520. At the same time, it's interesting that the percentage of new names on the map is higher in this portion than it is in the southernmost parts of the map. And perhaps it makes sense that the parts of the coast that are closer to Europe that were easier to access would change more quickly. It's hard to know. We look at the southern tip of Africa. Again, the multispectral image is very helpful. We see the Cape of Good Hope, and we are now able to read the place names there. It's interesting how few place names are there. I mentioned earlier that the cartographer does not attempt to depict the eastern coast of Africa at all. But even on the southwestern part of Africa, there are many fewer place names. He shows many fewer place names than were known at the time. So this is a map from about 1504 that shows a much denser toponymy in the southern part of Africa than we see on the map in the Harry Ransom Center. So this is a good indication that this part of the continent just wasn't of interest to the cartographer. That's not the function of the map was not to guide voyages around the tip of Africa to the Indian Ocean. It was for commerce on the western coast of Africa, and the Portuguese had plenty of things to do on the western coast of Africa. Returning to the rum lines. So again, just to go back to a typical nautical chart with a typical set of rum lines. This is the same chart we saw earlier by Battista Beccari. And I want to point out that all of the rum lines are drawn with the same emphasis. That is to say, there's no lines that are particularly emphasized. They're all drawn with the same force, we might say. Whereas that's not the case on our Portuguese chart. So here again are the nodes of the rum line network, but we have this system of emphasized parallel lines which are based on the rum line network. We can see that they go through the nodes of the rum line network, so it's not anything like a grid of latitude or longitude, but they are visually emphasized. And I think that should be used as a clue as to when the map was made, because I don't find early 16th century nautical charts that have a similar system. One part of the project that I still have to do is to figure out when this system started to be used. But one example that does come to mind is a Portuguese world map made in 1559 by Andreas Homan in the BNF. So we can see here that it has the typical compass roses, typical system of rum lines. And if we zoom out, we can see the nodes of the rum line network form a circle, as we expect. But at the same time, we zoom in, we can see that there is this additional grid, which is, again, based on the rum line network. It connects nodes in the rum line network, but these are not exactly traditional rum lines. And this example comes from 1559, substantially later in the 16th century. Again, I still need to determine when this type of rum line network first starts to appear, but I don't think it's around 1520. It's later in the century. So things still to do with the Ransom Center chart. So when did the Portuguese cartographers first start to use this system of parallel lines on nautical charts? And then I've recently come across this chart by another Portuguese cartographer, Gaspar Viegas, made in 1534. And it seems quite similar to the type of chart that we have in the Harry Ransom Center and the James Ford Bell Center maps, in that it's focused on the Atlantic world. It's not intended to help guide you in navigating to the Indian Ocean. And here is the rum line network on that chart. And if we crop the chart a bit, we get something that's pretty similar to what we have in the Ransom Center chart. So if we go back, we can see that this cartographer also doesn't bother depicting the eastern coast of Africa. So we can imagine that the Ransom chart originally looked something like this chart from 1534. So I now need to read all the place names on that chart and compare them with what we have in the Ransom chart, now that those place names are legible, and see if that's a better match in terms of the time period in which the chart was created. So looking to the future, one project I'm involved with Julie and Dave is bringing multispectral imaging to Latin America, and with Roger as well. So this is to take the MISHA low-cost multispectral imaging system, which was developed here, to Colombia. And here is the National Library of Colombia. As I said earlier, it took some time to find the right partners in Colombia. And I spent a lot of time developing the project with a colleague who used to work at the National Library, Anthony Picon Rodriguez. I gave a talk in Spanish about the system. I gave the PowerPoint to Anthony. He gave the talk in Colombia multiple times, also to provincial libraries, to demonstrate the technology to them so that they could understand what it can do and identify candidates in their collection for imaging. And we obtained a grant from the Whitting Foundation, and a team from the National Library of Colombia visited at RIT a few days ago to learn about multispectral imaging, learn about the MISHA system, assemble it and disassemble it, and take it back to the National Library of Colombia. So this is an extremely exciting development, and I really see it as the first step to take it first to Colombia and then spread more broadly in Latin America. And then I mentioned earlier a couple of other imaging projects I would like to do. Now I can talk about them with images. Roger showed a few images of one of them, but I'll start off with the other one from Mauro's world map of about 1455, which is in the Biblioteca Marciana in Venice. It's almost 2 meters in diameter. As you can see, it's an absolutely spectacular object. And in looking at the map, I noticed that in some of the cartouches and some of the descriptive texts, if you look closely, you can see that originally there was a shorter text and it's been painted over with a longer and larger text. And it would be very interesting indeed to be able to read that earlier shorter text and thus see how the map has evolved. And there are multiple cases like this on the map of these shorter descriptive texts that have been replaced with longer texts. And as I mentioned, this is something I've wanted to do for about 10 years now. And I'm on my 3rd director of the library. And things now seem to be moving forward, which is an exciting prospect. And then Martin Bechheim's terrestrial globe of 1492, which you just saw in Roger's presentation, so I'll move quickly here. The surface of the globe is very dense with text, substantial portions of which have faded significantly. And then also in other areas, a later hand has gone over the text and rewritten what they thought that it said. And we mentioned, Roger and I, that Ken Boydston was able to take some test images of the globe in 2017 under very unfavorable conditions. And you just saw the same image a few minutes ago. The multispectral images were very successful in recovering a bit of the text. And we can see the question is how this hand, probably in the 19th century, that went over the globe, rewriting the texts or what they thought the text said, how accurate was that process? If we had reason to believe that it was incredibly accurate, then there wouldn't necessarily be a lot of point in trying to determine what the earlier texts were. But we have very strong evidence here that the texts are not similar at all. And we can see that by going back and forth between these two images. Just the locations and shapes of the words are not the same at all. So the new text is very different from the old text and makes revealing the earlier text a priority. And I first started discussing this project with imaging colleagues, with the Lazarus Project, and then with the Germanisches National Museum in 2015. And yes, we're waiting for them to finish the 5-year project before we can continue our discussions of this project. So in general, there is still much to be done. And unfortunately, patience is often necessary for the most important projects. But I want to emphasize that there is a value in waiting for those really important projects. It's easier to obtain funding to work on really important projects. And then when the projects are finished, they get a lot of attention, and that should make it easier to negotiate access for future projects. Thank you very much.
Just for Chet.
You were with the area where you were highlighting the Cape of Good Hope? Yes. Here? Right there, yeah. What are the little dots and X's? Those indicate navigational hazards. Yeah.
What lighthouse?
Yes.
So you mentioned several times that a lot of these maps were not used for guiding you, for navigating. So what did the ship captains use, and how was that relationship with these particular charts? I mean, we sort of take for granted the availability of data right now, but I can't imagine making copies of any of these things for distribution. So what was the sort of like the map or like the chart back then?
Yeah, well, allow me to clarify. What I was trying to say was that this map would not have been used to navigate around the Cape of Good Hope to reach India, which is something that the Portuguese did a lot of. This would have been used for navigating down the coast of Africa and to Brazil. And when the Portuguese were going to Brazil a lot and visiting the western coast of Africa a lot, so this would have been a useful chart. And as a matter of fact, many copies were made of manuscript charts like this. And in some cases, some surviving charts have pinholes in them, which was part of the copying process. And we also have, there's an Italian cartographer, Battista Agnese. We have, I think it's 75 surviving manuscript atlases by him of nautical charts. And those, yeah, I should say that the makers of nautical charts were serving two very different audiences. On the one hand, they were making relatively plain maps like this one, by which I mean relatively undecorated maps like this one, which would have been used for navigation. And at the same time, they were making very elaborately decorated maps with the same cartographic underpinnings, the same rumline network, the same emphasis on coastal place names, but then with a lot of decoration, with images of sovereigns and animals and ships and sea monsters. And those maps were produced for collection and display by nobles. So it's interesting that they were serving two very distinct markets, but yes.
Speaking of markets, can you give us a sense of how much these would have cost people back then?
Let's see. So a chart like this, I can't give you numbers off the top of my head. And I have looked at some of the numbers, and there's a lot of variation. So there are cases where there are two very similar manuscripts of Ptolemy's geography, let's say, that were very similar levels of decoration that we know sold for very, very different prices. And that difference in price continues even into the 17th and 18th century. And it can depend on how the maps are marketed. So there was a case of an English atlas of the Pacific coasts of the New World, which was copied from a Spanish atlas. And it has indications of the locations of shipwrecks. And this English cartographer added to those indications of the locations of shipwrecks, indications of how much Spanish treasure he thought was on the ships. And a copy of this atlas sold for, I'm trying to remember, something like 30 pounds in England. But there was another copy that a Dutchman owned, and he tried to sell it to the Spanish court, and he marketed it as a guide to recovering Spanish treasure from Spanish wrecks. So, King of Spain, here's an opportunity for you to recover your own treasure. And I think the price he negotiated was, 50 times higher. So marketing mattered. Yes.
And there, some of the areas of the map, the cartography looks pretty good. Is there any interest or any value in comparing it to modern maps? Like, how much does the coastline change if we had enough accuracy in the original map?
It has changed a lot. So the general shape does look pretty accurate, but once you get into the details, it all falls apart. The longitude is wrong. You would not want to use a map like this to navigate today. Yeah.
So that's all errors in the original maps? Or
Yes.
is it the coastline that changed?
It's errors in the original maps, yes.
I'm interested in the evolution of the rumline system and the function. And it occurs to me that I mean, thinking from the perspective of, say, a graph or reading graphs, graph theory, it would be interesting, did they ever evolve in these maps a kind of directed method so that the edges have a particular vector?
So that the orientation of the map is...
Yeah, you have vertices or nodes, and then you have these edges that, and I'm interested in whether or not this system gave value or weighted values to either the direction of travel and whether there was indicated by color or some other method. And that's the first question. And second of all, what function do they really have?
The two questions are related. So we have nautical charts that go back to the 14th century. We do not have a 14th century text that talks about run lines, but we do have a 16th century text. And the basic idea was that they were helpful in setting a course. And we saw that if you're going to put a decorative wind rose on a map or a compass rose, it will go on one of the nodes of the rumline network. But the idea was that if you wanted to go from point A to point B, you would find a rum line that was as close to parallel to that course as possible. And then you would read that rum line back, and that would tell you what that course was. And then you knew that you wanted to set approximately that course to go from point A to point B. Is that incredibly useful? I would say no, but it's better than nothing, I guess. And going back to the first part of your question, one nice thing about the rum lines is they allow you to do that for any course. So even if you're typically sailing to the same points again and again, if you get off course, the rum lines help you get back. So it's a system that the idea was it could help you no matter where you were.
But I would be interested to see if they had the forethought, or maybe it would work, to see if it's a directed graph, it might indicate currents, which if you move in one direction, you're going to get there much faster, or it might take you off.
Yeah.
And it might be interesting or useful to indicate which direction the current is along a particular rum line.
Yes. The indications of currents I've seen on early maps, there's one indication of a whirlpool off the coast of Norway in 1539. But most often they're very stylized indications of just there's activity in the water's moving, but nothing specific. It's really not until the late 18th and 19th century that we start to get actual indications of currents. Oh, yes, sir.
So I'm originally from Western Australia,
Uh-huh.
and there's a long history of interest in the mapping of the coast of Western Australia and the rest of Australia as well, because the French, the Portuguese, and the Dutch had maps. The story always was that a lot of those maps were like secrets, like top secret stuff, because they didn't want the other trading nations to find out. So the belief was there were a lot better maps out there, but they, they weren't revealed publicly to people. And a lot of stories in Australia about that there's secret maps in Goa, because Goa was the capital of the Portuguese Empire in that part of the world, but these maps have never been found. Is this any of this? Is this folklore true, or is this just a story?
It's a good question, and it's hard to give an easy, clear, concise answer, because on the one hand, we have documents that discuss this policy of secrecy, and supposedly the Portuguese had a policy of secrecy, the Dutch had a policy of secrecy, but they were violated left, right, and center. So even the official Spanish cartographers, so the Spanish had a very good system. The Casa de Contratación in Seville maintained the official Spanish world map. And anytime an explorer came back to Seville, they were to give their information to the Casa, and they would update this world map. And there are also Spanish documents that talk about this desire for secrecy, but the official cosmographer to the Spanish crown also had the right to make copies of this map and sell them. And the Dutch case is sort of easier to follow the documents, and there was this, particularly early in the Dutch voyages to the Indian Ocean, the maps, there was some prohibition against reproducing them, but at the very same time, they were being printed. And then I'm trying to remember when it was, certainly by the 18th century, the prohibition was completely ignored, and the very best maps that were available in the Netherlands were being printed. So there's talk about the policy of secrecy, but at the same time, maps were being printed and stolen and copied left, right, and center. So it was, what's the line from Shakespeare? More observed in the breach than, yeah.
I was interested in the second slide on the Schönau map when you were looking at the southern continent.
Uh-huh.
Up at the top, there was. Well, let's get the one where we're looking right at the.
Oh, okay.
I think it was there. Hold on, we had it. Or yes, there it is. Right up at about 11:30, there's this little island that says that something is idolatrous.
Yes.
What is it that's idolatrous? I couldn't read. It looks like a Z and then something, something, something. And why would it be idolatrous?
It's not the island, it's the inhabitants who are idolatrous.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm not remembering which island that is. If it's a Z, there are some displacements of Zanzibar. So
Yes, that's what it is.
yeah.
It's a Z, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a Zanzibar. Okay, so yeah. That makes me feel, but because you were talking about all these features, of course, which aren't there, and I wondered what, it leads straight into almost religion, geography, where geography crosses religion.
Yes. Well, there certainly was an interest in religious geography. So on Waldseemüller's 1507 world map, there are little crosses and little crescents in Asia. So yeah, mapping religion was a strong interest.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I was looking at the Portuguese map.
Uh-huh.
There was a bit that you pointed to, which was erased, and it looked a hell of a lot like Costa Brava.
Okay, I
It was
don't have that one in
COS. It
mind.
was a COS blank A, and I thought I saw the crossbar.
Okay,
And it started with a B, and then there was an A at the end.
yeah,
and
okay, I'll look.
Three letters, but there we are.
It was a pleasure to walk in here and just have everything work. Roger was giving a talk in the other room.
I assume you guys got busy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me give you the back.